College London. She really has the most impressive bio I think I've ever seen. It's very long, so I'm not going to read it all out or we'll be here forever. So just to take some highlights, she is currently the co-director of the Imperial Clinical Trial Units and has the chair in medical statistics and clinical trials. She regularly advises the EMEA and sits on the editor's board for multiple journals, including the British Medical Council. And she also has an OBE. Please welcome Professor Deborah Ashby.
Thank you. So the mic is now live. Excellent. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to this group. And I should say, by training and profession indeed, I'm a statistician. I've worked in epidemiology and trials. In terms of things like programming, I started off doing Fortran and goodness knows what else. These days I work with a very large team, so any technical questions I'll take back to them. But what I want to tell you about is a project which I've been involved in for the last 5 years, which is about predominantly looking at benefit risk for drug regulations. It's a big EU product. And although it's not the only part, one of the main things is to think about visualizing these things. So what I'm going to show you, I'll explain about the project. I'm going to be showing you lots of examples of visualization. But what I would say, by way of a disclaimer, if you like, is that in a technical sense, these are pretty rudimentary. I'll explain why. So this is also a challenge to many of the people here as to how one can take these sort of ideas on and develop them much further. So to start with, we're talking about, in this whole project, about decision making. And it's worth making a few remarks about who decision makers are, because it drives a lot of what you do. It then drives who you're doing, for example, visualizations for. So I would say that a patient makes decisions for themselves, but very much in discussion with their healthcare provider. Their healthcare provider is constrained by what's on their prescribing list, which is usually, in most jurisdictions these days, very much affected by what the health technology assessment people think. That depends on cost effectiveness, but they can't look at things until the regulators have pronounced. And the regulators make decisions, but they can only make decisions on things that pharma have asked them to make decisions on. And a few years back in the UK, we had a lot of media interest in a drug called Herceptin. At the time, it was being trialled for early stage breast cancer. And it was a national scandal that various women didn't have access to it as a matter of life and death. The reason the patients didn't have access to it was because it wasn't on the healthcare provider's list. They couldn't have it because National Institute for Clinical Excellence hadn't pronounced on it. They couldn't pronounce on it because the regulators hadn't yet determined whether it was efficacious and safe and of decent quality. I think the quality was okay because it was on the license, it was marketed for something else. But they couldn't do anything because the company was still fine-tuning their submission. As soon as that went in, the thing whipped through. The regulator said, yes, you know, one benefit, one risk, that's okay. The health technology people said, yes, that's cost effective. So the healthcare providers could provide it and the woman could do it. So decision making is a very constrained process. And different things will drive those decisions at different places. And I have to say the evidence base for each of them was pretty much the same. So I've been doing, among the many things I do, is drug regulation. And I do advise the European Medicines Agency, but I also have sat on Commission on Human Medicines in the UK for 20-odd years, which is very much a routine job in some senses. Piles of paper or big computer files arrive every month, and you have to digest them and then make decisions. But in reflecting on it, you think, why am I doing this? Well, because someone asked me once, and they say thank you occasionally, but the task is to make good and defensible decisions on which medicine should receive a license. But it's increasingly important to be able to justify those, to explain those decisions to patients and other stakeholders. You know, why was Herceptin granted a license when other drugs might not be? And the debate that's been coming up on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed I've been to Japan to talk about this as well, is can more formal approaches of decision making, and especially more modern methods of graphical display, help regulators do this better? And so what was set up was a big European project. Some of you may know about the IMI initiatives in medicines, and that's led by European Medicines Agency and GSK and Novartis, whose premises we are very much a partner in that, as are many other companies. And so we were charged with doing quite a lot. The first thing we were asked to do was a methodological review of what was available for benefit risk. And there is, if you've ever looked into it, a huge literature. So we actually worked not by doing primary review, but by looking at the reviews other people had done. And what we found was long alphabetical lists. I warn you in a minute, there's a lot of initials coming up, only some of which I will tell you what they are. And I thought, I can't make head nor tail of this. So the first thing we did was to divide them into groups. There are things, and I'll talk a bit more about them, which are essentially frameworks for doing benefit risk decision making. There are then a bunch of things which are essentially about metric indices. There were other things in there that were being badged as benefit risk, things like Kaplan-Meier curves, so that's a statistical technique. You know, it might be useful in benefit risk, but it's not only a benefit risk technique. So we put that in the books that many statisticians will recognize, I hope, as some very fundamental statistical techniques. And then what we called utility survey techniques, which has turned out to be the most challenging and interesting bit, which is how you find out how stakeholders value the different things you might be weighing up. So in the final box, we've got things like stated preference methods, conjoint analysis, discrete choice experiments. In the estimation techniques, we've got directed acyclical graphs. You know, to me, that's a very, very powerful, but very, very general stats technique. Confidence profile methods, mixed treatment comparisons. In the metric indices, things as allegedly straightforward as numbers needed to treat and numbers needed to harm, things like impact numbers, QALYs, Q-twists, and then things that lead you towards trading off the different outcomes of benefit and risk, such as benefit risk ratios and lots of others. And then finally, there are frameworks. There's been a lot of work on BRAT, which is by the Benefit Risk Assessment Team, which was largely based in pharma, fairly US heavy. There's something called PractURL, which is a very general decision-making framework that's been around for several decades. And because benefit risk has nice initials, we've got COBRA, SABRE is the South Asian, UMBRA, which is the unified, that's what the U stands for. And then we've got things like MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis. Now, these are not lots of different techniques. There's huge overlaps between them. But we said we wanted to work through case studies, of which I will show you results from just one. We cannot take all of these forward. So what the red highlights is the techniques we thought we would take forward to test out, partly because they were complementary to each other, partly because people are arguing strongly for them, or in some cases numbers needed to treat, people are arguing strongly against them, but clearly we needed to show empirically what we could and couldn't do. And if you're interested in following up those methods much more, we've got big reports on the web, but there's also now an article just come out in Pharmacoepidemiology and Drug Safety. Now, I'm going to show you some examples, and what I need to say about this and any other examples we do is basically, it's just for fun. What I mean by that is that we deliberately chose case studies where the benefit-risk balance was very sensitive. So if you do slightly different analyses with different data or different, what we call preferences, you're going to get different answers. And we made policy decisions to work only with the publicly available data, whereas regulators may well have party to other data. So although these are realistic as we can do it for purposes, the purpose is to demonstrate the methods. So as I said, someone else doing it slightly differently may come up with a different answer. And the one I thought I'd show you, I mean, not least because one of the people who put a lot of work into this is based at Novartis, Richard Nixon, is natalizumab, which, interestingly, I didn't know what the previous speaker was going to talk on, but this one is also multiple sclerosis. And natalizumab is a drug that came on, and it was licensed in the US. It actually works, which was certainly in 2004 for multiple sclerosis was something of a rarity. And then in 2005, it was suspended because there was this very severe side effect, progressive multifocal leukonephropathy, and I only say that once, which is basically I'm not a physician, But my understanding is these drugs affect the immunity, and so then something gets across the blood-brain barrier, and it's potentially and often quite frequently fatal. So it's a very nasty side effect, and regulators, as you know, were nervous people, so yeah, that came off the market. But the story didn't stop there, because the patients said, hang on a minute, we like this drug, we know there's a nasty side effect, but it's not very frequent, let us be the judge of that. And that's one of these pivotal moments in the whole debate about who drives these decisions. And it was reintroduced largely because of patient demands in the US, and about the same time it was approved in the EU. Now, the PML cases have continued to accrue. It wasn't a flash in the pan, it's perfectly genuine. There are now lots of them. And so in 2009, the CHMP, the major European regulator, reassessed it and continued approval. So clearly, this is a drug with a very delicate benefit-risk balance. But that makes it very good for our case study. Now, we've done, as I said, I'm summarising 5 years' work in sort of 20-odd minutes here. So after going through 6 of these case studies, we've come up with various recommendations, and it's in a roadmap that, again, is in reports. We're coming up with websites, so you can look at this interactively. But essentially what you need to go through is a kind of planning stage, evidence gathering, data prep stage, analysis, exploration, and communication, conclusion, dissemination. The planning is by far the most important stage. You're thinking through the critical issues, purpose and content, documenting. The evidence gathering, you then decide what data you need, what sort of state it's in. Analysis in this context is when you start to tie that together with how people care about the endpoints. Exploration is when you say, okay, our assumptions, this is laden with assumptions, they may not be right. Is it sensitive to these assumptions? And conclusion and dissemination is when you say, right, we've done all of this work, but how do we turn this into a simple message so people can actually understand what we've done, but that doesn't kind of lose the important detail? And as you can imagine, visualization plays a big role in all of these. So for the planning, it's the frameworks that really kick in, and I will go through in a second, PhURL and BRAT. And you're using things like tree diagrams, not necessarily highly sophisticated visuals, but just ones to help people see the wood for the trees. So for ProAct, you go through and say, what's your problem, what's your objective, alternative, what's your consequence, what's your trade-off. That's the ProAct bit of it. But the URL is bringing in something about uncertainty, risk tolerance, and what are your linked decisions? If you take this off the market, are people suddenly going to go running and using something else that may be equally dangerous? BRAT goes through very much the same things. And so either of these are steps to step you through what's the question we're trying to answer, who's the decision making, what comparators are we looking at, and so on. But the conclusion we came to was actually there's not a lot to choose between these frameworks. The important thing is to use some systematic approach. There's others who will argue so they're blue in the face about the exact nuances, but actually, most of them are very fit purpose. You then drop a value tree, and for a drug like natalizumab, you've got your benefits, which are chiefly a reduction in relapse rate and to some extent a slowdown in disability progression. You've got things about ease or difficulty of administration, and then you've got a lot of risks. All of it seems to be about PML, but actually you've got the herpes viral infections, your seizures, abortion or congenital abnormalities, and then things that, at least for the patient, may be quite mild, transaminase elevation, infusion or injection site reactions, hypersensitivity, flu-like reactions. So that immediately, to my mind, gives you a visualization of what it is you're trying to balance. And having done regulation for years, where you have all of your clinical trials in one dossier, and then kind of several hundred pages later in a different part of the dossier, you have these tables of numbers on safety. The very idea that you've even got a summary on the same page is actually a really major advance. Because once you've got that in your mind, you can start thinking about it in a more structured way. Once you start bringing your evidence together, then we're into what most of us would recognize as fairly standard statistical techniques. And visualization, structured, color-coded tables, network graphs, all kind of help. So just as an example for natalizumab, when we did the case study, we first of all did it just against placebo, but then we said, actually, we want to be able to compare it to a couple of the comparators. And if we were doing it now, we'd probably need to add others into this. But of course, What we've got is head-to-head comparisons of each of them against placebo. What we don't have is the indirect comparisons. But there are methods, the indirect treatment comparisons, give you ways of doing the head-to-head comparisons via the making comparisons about placebo. It makes strong assumptions about the groups being comparable and the treatment arms being comparable in other ways. But you can do it. And so again, you know, graphically, this is a nice way of showing what you're trying to do. And you've got the trials in there, which are the direct comparisons, and then you're seeing where you're making indirect comparisons. In a different graph, you may also have some direct comparisons of the head-to-head. And then, if you're then trying to come up with a first summary of what the results are, what you can have is one line for each of those outcomes. You can turn it into risk per 1,000 patients, risk difference. But again, the visualization starts to come in that if you color code it, you can see that the yellow things are where it's higher for the active comparator, blue is where it's higher for placebo. And again, it helps you, you'd obviously need to spend more time on this than I'm spending for the purpose of this talk, but it helps you get a sense of where the big differences are. Then moving on to analysis, you might want to use numbers needed to treat, although in something with several outcomes like this, I don't see how you could do that. But more likely, in the kind of thing our teams were doing things like multi-criteria decision analysis, which is where you start to sort of weigh up the different outcomes and then say, well, depending how you value those different outcomes, how's the benefit-risk balance looking? And just things like discrete choice experiments, which are much used in economics but are now being sort of trialed in medicines, are again ways of finding out how groups of patients, or for that matter groups of physicians, think about the trade-offs. And they've all got their own benefits and risks. And all of these come with their own associated visualization techniques. I'll show you a Macbeth grid in just a minute. So the Macbeth grid is one of the techniques you might use for seeing how people feel about the seriousness of those different side effects. So for example, in the first row, PML, we've got a scale that goes from no, very weak, through to extreme. The PML is extreme compared to having an abortion or congenital malformation. It's extreme compared to seizures. It's extreme compared to anything. Yeah. If you had to have one of them, it's the one you absolutely would not want. Whereas, for example, seizures, a couple of lines down, are seen as only moderate compared to reactivation of serious herpes infection, but extreme compared to having no adverse effects. So you go through a technique to do this. This is just a display of it. That isn't terribly intuitive, but if you then overlay a graph on it, if having no adverse effects is given a value of 0 and PML given 100, because that's the worst, then you can see how the others are beginning to rank. So, for example, the abortion or congenital malformations is sort of right up there, but seizures and reactivation are fairly similar, and those red lines are kind of uncertainties, so that they show what the wiggle room is. And effectively, those two are interchangeable, but there's clear blue water between the others. So these are ways of trying to get a handle on how much worse you should take the PML or the abortion compared with some of the other side effects. So it's trying to quantify these things, which is not uncontroversial, but it's what we're trying to explore. So if you proceed with that, you've then got to take on board how serious these outcomes are, but that needs to be modified by how frequently they occur. So what we've got in this graph is sort of trying to summarize all of that. And the left-hand column is showing the weight that, so using a slightly different technique, the weight that might be assigned. And again, PML, that big blue bar, means this is serious. This dominates everything else if you were just choosing between a PML or one of the others. In terms of benefits, relapse is registering quite a lot, whereas things like the hypersensitivity reactions are barely flickering on that scale. So in terms of absolute seriousness, that's what the weight tells you. But the value is essentially driven by the data, and that's the difference between the groups. So actually, the biggest difference between, in this one's active and placebo, is that big pink bar. So massive difference in relapse rates, a bit of a difference in disability progression, much less convenience, certainly than placebo, But everything else, there's almost no difference. This time PML doesn't get a flicker because actually you're not going to get PML if you're on placebo, and you're almost certainly not going to get it if you're inactive. So the difference in rates in absolute terms is tiny. But there's quite a big negative effect in terms of infusion site reactions. So if you multiply them together, one by one, which is what a sort of formal decision analysis does, I won't show you the mathematics of it, but it's, yeah, you basically multiply them together. Then what's happening is the dominant bits of that are the relapse rate and the infusion site reactions, a little bit on disability progression, and most other things are actually barely there in the equation. And I think this is a sort of mathematical way of looking at what the patients were just coming up with intuitively. You know, that's what they're weighing up with their experience and why they came and said, actually, you know, we might want to take this. Now, it makes all sorts of assumptions, and you can then combine these with the showing how it does against other drugs, and again, it shows that against all of them, the relapse rate is absolutely dominant. That's the big pink one. You can show these things as waterfall plots, which is a different way of demonstrating the same data, and I won't go into the interactive bit now, but I'll make the slides available. If you want to go in, and one of my clinician friends doesn't think you should be considering administration in this, he thinks it's all about the benefits and risks, well, you can just untick administration, that'll redo without factoring in the administration. If you want a different comparator, you can factor in that, and I think the interactive way to go is really exciting. This is quite clunky because, again, we deliberately only use publicly available software, but I think this is where you can imagine sort of slicker versions of this are probably the way forward, that regulators and others can actually explore these things in real time. To explore the assumptions, again, a host of methodologies and visualization techniques. And so this is a tornado plot, and I apologize, when you've reviewed my slides, those who are red, green, colorblind, I'll have to talk about left and right. So that's the kind of feedback we need, but I couldn't get it changed in time. This one is looking at sensitivity to the data. So if the relapse rates are 20% less in terms of difference or 20% more, that makes the biggest difference, but it's still all positive. Whereas coming down, it really doesn't matter how ropey the data is on the PML and the seizures. In terms of the benefit risk, it's not going to change your decision. And you can do these to look at differences in the weights or differences in the utilities, to see, because what you want to know is what's driving your inflammation, and that may feed into your risk management plan that, yeah, maybe it's transaminase elevation that you actually need to keep the most careful eye on, because that's the one that you've got least information about. You can, of course, I'm a Bayesian statistician, be fully Bayesian about this, and so instead of just getting point estimates, you can do a full probabilistic analysis that, again, I won't share with you in the interest of time, but you display it, and again, it clearly shows that natalizumab's benefit risk is clear blue water from the others. The two active ones are almost interchangeable, but overlapping a bit with placebo. And you can come out with things, what's the probability that natalizumab is ranked first for this set of data under this set of utilities? So again, and these could recalculate in real time. And then in terms of conclusion, you need to disseminate this and bring it all together. And we feel we're just scratching the surface. There are lots of other data visualization initiatives that we've been plagiarizing mercilessly. Some of you may know Understanding Uncertainty, David Spiegelhalter's website. Smiley faces feed into some of what we're doing. And lots of things that, yeah, I think there is huge potential here. So just to sort of wrap up, what we're finding in the project as a whole is that formally structured benefit risk can aid transparency and communication. These methodologies don't make decisions themselves, they're supporting decision making, and they're certainly not intended to replace medical expertise. But they're intended to sort of flush out what people know in their heads but don't always write down. But it's really important working with the stakeholders, patients and public involvement. And again, we've done a bit of that working with the International Alliance of Patient Organisations, but we need to get far better at it. We're great at collecting the data, we understand that, but it's actually those weights that really drive whether you should be using these things. So, it puts benefits and risks on the same page, it gives a framework. I think I've said transparency facilitates discussion. The visual representations are absolutely key to this. But I keep being asked by regulators and others about trade-offs between being too simplistic or being incomprehensible. It can be seen as a black box, which is a real shame. when I talk to people in pharma, and I hope you don't, they say, well, what do the regulators want? Well, the regulators are saying, we're feeling our way here. We want to see some really good examples. You know, put your thinking caps on. And how you present it visually really can influence perceptions. So I think huge amount of work to do in this space. There are slides at the end on resources, but I will be happy to circulate those for anybody who wants them. I'd rather stop there and take questions. So thank you.
Any questions? Ooh. Oh.